Somebody get him out of the hallway before Whitcomb sees him.
The voice belonged to Trent Ackerley, 34 years old, Associate Director of Operations, the kind of man who'd learned to whisper insults the exact volume a room could pretend not to hear. He said it to no one and everyone, the way men like Trent always did, glancing sideways at the man with the mop bucket like he was a stain on the marble he hadn't gotten to yet. Warren Doyle didn't look up. He never did. 18 years of mornings just like this one had taught him that looking up only gave men like Trent something to react to, and reacting only gave them more to say. So he kept the mop moving in slow, even strokes, the gray water sloshing quiet against the yellow bucket wheels, and he let the words pass over him the way rain passes over a roof that's stopped noticing it's raining. It was 7:42 in the morning. The building wouldn't officially open for another 18 minutes, but the top floor of Halloway Steel had been awake since 5, because today the vultures were circling, and vultures don't wait for office hours. Through the frosted glass of the East Conference Room, Warren could see shapes moving, the sharp, expensive shapes of men who billed $4,000 an hour to sit in leather chairs and decide the fate of 1,100 employees who'd never get invited into that room. Somewhere behind that glass sat Preston Kane, 41 years old, worth $11 billion, here in person because a deal this size didn't get handled by proxy. Kane Holdings didn't buy companies, it absorbed them, restructured them, and sold off whatever was left in pieces, like a man picking a chicken clean and setting the bones aside. Halloway Steel had built rail couplings and structural fasteners for 61 years. Warren had known the founder. Warren had known the founder's wife better. That was a fact nobody in this building carried anymore except him, and he intended to keep it that way for a little while longer. Doyle. Trent said his name now, sharper. The floor. Move it. We've got people coming through here in 10 minutes who don't need to see. He gestured vaguely at the mop, at the bucket, at the gray uniform with Doyle stitched crooked over the breast pocket, at the fact of him. Almost done, Warren said. His voice was low and even, sanded smooth by years of not needing anyone to hear it. Almost isn't done. Trent checked his phone. You know what today is? I know what today is. Then you know it's not a good day to be slow. Warren straightened, one hand pressed briefly against the small of his back, the old ache that came from 6 decades of a body that had done more lifting than resting. He looked at Trent for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be noticed, short enough not to be a challenge, and then he wheeled the bucket toward the service elevator without another word. Behind him, the conference room door opened. Voices spilled into the hallway, expensive voices, the kind that had never had to ask permission for anything. Warren didn't turn around, but he heard the tail end of a sentence in a voice he didn't recognize, one that carried the particular flatness of a man used to being agreed with. 48 hours, Whitcomb. My people don't wait for signatures. Get me the last one, and we close Friday. Marcus Whitcomb, CEO of Halloway Steel for the last 9 years, laughed the laugh of a man trying to sound unbothered while sweating through his shirt. It's a formality. The trust's been dormant 15 years. We'll have it by Wednesday. You said that Monday. There's a luff. The beneficiary's identity is sealed. Legal has to go through the original instrument. It's paperwork, Preston. That's all it is. Then get someone smarter than paperwork to move it. The elevator arrived. Warren stepped in, wheeled his bucket beside him, and pressed the button for the basement level, where the supply room and the old records vault shared a hallway nobody else had reason to walk down. As the doors slid shut, he caught one more fragment of the conversation. Whitcomb's voice pitched thin with the particular fear of a man about to lose the only thing he had left to sell. The initials on the trust are WD. We don't even know if he's alive. The doors closed. Warren Doyle rode the elevator down in silence, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself almost smile. Here is what the building believed about Warren Doyle, to the extent it thought about him at all. That he was 61, maybe 62. That he'd worked the night shift for years before switching to mornings. That he was quiet, competent, occasionally seen eating lunch alone on the loading dock, even in weather that made the smokers complain. That he'd been here longer than almost anyone, longer than Whitcomb, longer than half the department heads, longer than the building's current paint job, which had been redone twice since he started. Here is what the building did not know. That Warren Doyle had once stood in the exact spot where the executive elevator now hummed quietly upward, and watched concrete get poured for a foundation he had designed himself on graph paper at a kitchen table in a house that no longer existed. That the ring he wore on a chain under his collar instead of his finger, because rings caught in machinery, a habit from another life, was engraved with 2 sets of initials, and one of them was his. That the framed black and white photograph in the 3rd-floor stairwell, the one everyone assumed was decorative, 2 young engineers shaking hands in front of a half-built plant, 1987, stamped in the corner, showed, on the left, a woman named Eleanor Doyle, and beside her, unrecognizable now under 61 years and a hairline that had long since retreated, a younger version of the man currently mopping the basement hallway. Warren had built this company with his wife. He had buried his wife 11 years ago in a cemetery 40 minutes outside the city, in a plot beneath an oak tree she'd picked out herself the year the plant broke ground, because she said she wanted to rest somewhere that could still hear the trains. 2 years after that, when the grief had hollowed him into something he no longer recognized in mirrors, he had walked back into the building that bore neither of their names, because they'd sold the naming rights to a distributor decades before it mattered, and asked for a job. Not a board seat, not an office, a job. The head of facilities at the time, a woman named Rosa Nunez, who had since retired to Florida and never learned who she'd actually hired, looked at the application, looked at the references, which listed only a previous employer she'd never heard of, and a single line. Worked in industrial operations, 31 years, and said the position paid $14 an hour, and the hours were 6 to 2. Warren had said that would be fine. He had never corrected anyone's assumption about who he was, not once in 18 years. It was easier that way. Grief does strange arithmetic to a man. Some days he told himself he stayed because the building was the last place Eleanor's hands had touched. Her blueprints still buried in the walls, whether anyone remembered drawing them or not. Some days he told himself he stayed to watch, quietly, the way a man watches a grave from a respectful distance, to make sure nobody dug it up wrong. But there was a third truth, one he rarely let himself look at directly, and it was this. 15 years ago, when he and Eleanor had sold their controlling interest to a holding structure to keep the business alive after the recession nearly buried it, they had built one clause into the trust instrument that neither of them ever expected to matter. Any sale, merger, or dissolution of Halloway Steel above a certain valuation required the personal, notarized consent of the Class A trust beneficiary, identified in the documents only by initials, W.D. Warren Doyle had never planned to use that clause as a weapon. He had built it as a promise to the workers on the floor who had no golden parachutes, no severance packages measured in years' salary, nothing but their hands and their hours and their faith that a paycheck would keep coming. He had built it because he'd watched, over 30 years in this industry, what happened to companies when they got sold to men who saw 1,100 names as a line item to be minimized. He'd sworn, quietly, to himself and to Eleanor's memory, that Halloway Steel would never be handed to someone like that without a fight. He hadn't needed the clause in 15 years. He needed it now. And the strange, aching irony of it, the thing that made him almost smile in that elevator, was this. The men upstairs, tearing through legal archives, dispatching junior associates to track down a ghost shareholder who might be dead for all they knew, had walked past that ghost 41 times a week for 18 years. They had told him to move his mop out of their way. They had never once asked his name past what was stitched on his chest. The elevator doors opened onto the basement. Warren wheeled his bucket out, and above him, 11 floors up, the deal that was supposed to close in 48 hours had just hit a wall built entirely out of the fact that nobody in that boardroom had ever bothered to see him. By Wednesday, the building had a smell to it, the particular tension sweat of an office watching its own future get decided behind closed doors. Warren had smelled it before, in other companies, other decades. Whenever the machinery of an acquisition ground into gear, people started being nicer to each other in the break room and crueler everywhere else. Rumors moved faster than the elevators. The rumor moving fastest by Wednesday afternoon was this: the deal was in trouble, and somebody was going to pay for it. "They're saying legal can't find the guy," said Dale Prater, a machinist who'd worked the floor for 22 years and treated Warren, unlike most of the office staff, with the plain courtesy one tradesman gives another. They were in the break room, Dale on his lunch, Warren refilling the coffee station because the machine had jammed again. Some shareholder from the old days. Whitcomb's losing his mind. You hear anything? Working down in the records room and all? I mop the records room, Warren said. I don't read the records. Dale laughed, not unkindly. Probably smarter than the rest of us either way. My cousin's company got bought out by one of these private equity outfits 2 years back. 6 months later, half the floor was gone. They don't want people, Warren. They want the number people make. I've heard that. You worried? Warren wiped down the counter with a rag that had gone thin from years of washing. I've been worried about things I couldn't do anything about my whole life, Dale. Doesn't change much. He meant it as a small joke, the kind of dry understatement he allowed himself only with the handful of people in the building who spoke to him like a person instead of a fixture. But there was a version of the truth folded inside it that Dale would never guess at. That Warren was, in fact, the only person in the entire 11-story building who had the actual power to do something about it, and was choosing, for now, to do nothing but wait and watch and let them come to him. That was the hardest part. Not the years of being ignored. A man could build calluses over almost anything given enough time. The hardest part was watching men like Whitcomb sweat over a decision that Warren himself would ultimately have to make, and doing nothing because the moment wasn't right yet, because he needed to see how far they'd let this go before someone thought to ask a basic, obvious question. Who actually is WD? He got his answer to how far they'd let it go on Thursday morning, and it came in the shape of Trent Ackerley, red-faced, holding a coffee-stained folder, standing in the doorway of the supply closet where Warren was restocking paper towels. You, Doyle. Yes? Did you go into the East Conference room last night after hours? Warren set down the roll of paper towels. I clean the East Conference room every night. It's on my rotation. There were documents on that table, confidential documents. Kane's people are saying pages went missing from a legal binder. I emptied trash cans and vacuumed carpet, Mr. Ackerley. I don't touch paperwork. That's convenient. Trent's voice had the particular pitch of a man who needed someone to blame more than he needed the truth, because blame was faster, and truth required patience he didn't have under Preston Kane's deadline. You're in that room every night, alone, with no supervision. You have a badge that opens every door on this floor. That's the job. Maybe it shouldn't be. Trent's jaw worked. I want your badge access reviewed, today. And frankly, Doyle, given everything going on, I don't think it's a bad time to look at whether we even need a night cleaning position at all when the whole floor is about to be restructured anyway. Warren looked at him for a long moment, long enough that something in Trent's certainty flickered, just slightly, the way a man's confidence flickers when he realizes he said more than he meant to. You're firing me, Warren said, flat, not a question. I'm saying it's under review. During the biggest week this company's had in 15 years, you're threatening to fire the janitor over paperwork you can't prove went missing, instead of asking why your buyer can't find the one signature he actually needs. Something in Trent's face went still. That's not your business. No, Warren agreed quietly. I suppose it isn't. Not yet. He picked the paper towels back up and went back to work. And if Trent Ackerley had been even slightly less certain of his own importance, he might have noticed that the janitor's hands, for the first time in 18 years, were not entirely steady. Not from fear, but from the sheer, aching effort of holding back a truth 11 years in the making. That night, after the office emptied and the cleaning crews scattered to their sections, Warren let himself into the sub-basement records vault the way he had 1,000 nights before. Badge, code, the particular give of a door that had been swelling and shrinking with the seasons since 1994. But tonight, he didn't clean. He sat, instead, in the small chair by the microfiche cabinet, under a single working fluorescent tube, and pulled a drawer he hadn't opened in years. Inside, filed under a decade nobody had digitized, was a thin folder labeled in his own handwriting from a hand steadier than the one he had now. Trust Instrument, Original, 1987. Amendment, Do Not Destroy. He didn't need to read it. He'd written half of it. But he opened it anyway, the way a man returns to a grave he already knows the shape of, just to be near it a while. Clipped to the inside cover was a photograph, not the framed one in the stairwell, but a smaller print, worn soft at the corners. Eleanor, 29 years old, hard hat pushed back on her head, laughing at something outside the frame, one hand resting flat against a steel beam that would become, eventually, the load-bearing wall of the very building he sat beneath. Warren had taken that photograph. He remembered the exact moment, a joke about the beam being crooked, which it wasn't, which she'd pretended to be offended by for the rest of the afternoon. "They're looking for you," he said quietly, to the photograph, the way he sometimes did when the vault was empty and the building slept above him. 15 years, and they still don't know it's not a stranger. Some banker in Chicago, they think. Some retired investor. Nobody thinks it's the man who empties their trash. He closed the folder. Down the hall, footsteps. Warren went still, listening. The particular caution of a man who'd learned, across 18 years, exactly how to disappear into a room the moment before someone entered it. But the footsteps didn't come his way. They stopped 2 doors down, at the file room proper, where the after-hours legal team had set up a makeshift war room to hunt through 6 decades of corporate paper for a signature. Through the wall, muffled but audible in the vault's particular hush, he heard a young woman's voice, tired, patient, running through a list out loud to herself the way people do at midnight when they think no one can hear. Doyle, William. No, deceased, 2009, Ohio. Doyle, Walter. No middle initial match. Doyle, Warren. A pause, papers shuffling. Doyle, Warren, she said again, slower this time, like she'd caught something. Hired 2008. Facilities, same last name as the founder's wife on the original charter. Huh. Warren's hand, resting on the folder in his lap, went very still. Weird, the voice muttered, half to herself. Probably nothing. Common last name. But she didn't sound entirely convinced, and neither, sitting alone in the dark 2 doors away with his late wife's photograph in his lap, was Warren. The low point had arrived. Not loudly, not with a slammed door or a shouted accusation, but in the quiet, mundane way real turning points usually come. A tired paralegal, running her finger down a list at midnight, one name away from an answer nobody in the building was prepared for. Warren closed the folder, turned off the fluorescent light, and sat a while longer in the dark, because for the first time in 11 years, he understood that the choice of when to stop being invisible was about to be taken out of his hands. He didn't go home that night. Not right away. He walked instead, the long way, past the loading dock where he ate lunch alone, even in the cold, out into a parking lot lit orange by sodium lamps. And he sat in his truck for a long while without starting the engine, because there was a phone call he owed himself before anyone else forced the truth out of him. He didn't call anyone. Eleanor had been gone 11 years, and there was no one left who'd understand what this particular night meant the way she would have. But he talked to her anyway, quietly, the way he sometimes still did in the cab of that truck, windows fogging in the cold. "They're close," he said. "Closer than I planned for. I always thought I'd get to choose the moment. Guess that was never really up to me, was it?" The truck was silent except for the tick of the cooling engine and the distant hum of the highway. "I keep thinking about what you'd say. Probably that I waited too long. Probably that I let a boy half my age call me slow in a hallway for longer than any man should let another man talk to him that way." He rubbed a thumb along the steering wheel, an old habit, worn smooth. "But I didn't do it for pride, Ellie. I did it because the day I walked back in here, I didn't know if I could stand being reminded, every hour, of everything we built and lost in the same building. Cleaning it let me love it without it breaking me all over again." He sat with that for a long moment. "Guess I'll find out this week whether that was wisdom or just fear wearing a work shirt." He started the engine and drove home, and slept less than 4 hours, and was back at the building by 5:30 the next morning, because whatever was coming, he intended to meet it standing up, in the same gray uniform he'd worn every day for 18 years. Not because he needed the uniform anymore, but because he wasn't going to let anyone say he'd hidden behind anything. The next 2 days moved the way the days before a storm always move, too fast and too slow at once. Ordinary tasks made strange by the tension underneath them. Word had started to leak, the way it always does in a building full of people with nothing to do but wait for a deal to close or collapse. Not the full truth. Maria had said nothing yet, and the paralegal chasing names in the file room hadn't connected her fragment to anything solid, but a texture of unease, a sense among the staff that something had shifted, the particular electricity of an office that senses a secret is circulating even before anyone can name it. Dale Prater cornered Warren by the vending machines on Friday morning, voice low. "There's talk," Dale said, "that legal's been asking about employees who've been here longest. You've been here longer than God, Warren. They ask you anything?" "Not yet." "You worried?" Warren considered the question honestly, for once, instead of deflecting it the way he usually did. "I've spent 11 years being the only person in this building who knows something nobody else does. I think I'm more tired than worried, if I'm honest with you." Dale studied him a moment, the particular scrutiny of a man who'd spent 2 decades on a factory floor learning to read machinery and people with the same careful attention. "You're being awful strange about this, Warren. Strange for you." "Maybe it's time," Warren said, and left it there, because he wasn't ready yet to say more, not even to Dale, who had never once in 22 years spoken to him like he was furniture. That afternoon, Trent Ackerley's campaign to have Warren's badge access revoked quietly died in a meeting Warren wasn't invited to and didn't need to be, because Whitcomb, sweating through a 3rd shirt that week, had overruled it on the simple, practical grounds that firing facilities staff mid-acquisition, with a missing signature still unaccounted for, looked reckless to a buyer who was already furious about delays. Trent hadn't taken the reversal well. He'd taken to watching Warren from across rooms with the particular resentment of a man who suspects, without yet knowing why, that he has badly misjudged someone. By Saturday, Maria Castillo had stopped sleeping in any meaningful sense. She'd spent the better part of 2 days quietly cross-referencing county deed filings, an old zoning variance application that listed both Doyles as co-petitioners, and a digitized newspaper clipping from a defunct local business journal. "Halloway Steel breaks ground on second plant," the headline read, dated the same month as the photograph in the stairwell, with a caption crediting E&W Doyle, founding partners, beneath a grainy photo she now recognized instantly. She sat with that confirmation a long time before deciding what, if anything, to do with it. The easy thing, the thing that would have made her look sharp in front of Kane's team, the thing that any other second-year associate hungry for a partnership track would have done without hesitation, was to walk into Monday's meeting and hand over the name, tie the bow, take the credit for solving the puzzle that had stalled a $900 million deal. She didn't do the easy thing. Instead, on Sunday evening, she drove to the building on her own time, badge still active from the weekend legal push, and found Warren exactly where she suspected she would, in the sub-basement vault, alone, a folder open on his lap under a single working fluorescent tube. "I know," she said from the doorway, before she could talk herself out of it. Warren didn't startle. He looked up slowly, the way a man looks up who has spent 18 years training himself not to react quickly to anything. "I figured someone would, eventually," he said. "Took longer than I expected, if I'm honest." "I haven't told anyone." "Why not?" Maria stepped into the small room, arms crossed, more nervous than she wanted to let on. "Because the second I do, this stops being your decision. It becomes a headline, a negotiating chip, something Kane's team spins to make themselves look clever for discovering you, when all they actually did was hire me to read old paperwork faster than they could." She shook her head. "You've clearly been carrying this a long time. I didn't think it was my place to end it for you." Warren studied her for a long moment. The particular assessment of a man who had spent 18 years learning to read who could be trusted and who couldn't, mostly by watching what people did when they thought no one important was paying attention. "You're the only person in this building," he said finally, "who's asked me a question this week instead of telling me something." "Is it true? All of it? The founding, the trust, the clause?" "Every word." Maria exhaled, long and slow, and sat down on the edge of an old filing cart across from him. "Then can I ask you something else? Not for the deal. For me." "You can ask." "Why let it get this far? You could have walked into that boardroom the day the deal was announced and ended the chaos in 10 minutes. Instead, you let them tear the building apart looking for a ghost. You let them threaten to fire you. Why?" Warren closed the folder in his lap, gently, the way he closed most things. "Because I needed to see who they really were before I decided what to ask for," he said. A man like Kane can put on a good face for a press release. I needed to watch him under pressure, when he thought no one who mattered was watching, to know what kind of owner he'd actually be to the people on that floor. I needed to see whether Whitcomb would protect his own staff or throw them to the wolves the second his own neck was on the line. He looked at her steadily, and I needed to see whether there was a single person left in this building who still noticed people like me. Turns out there was. That mattered more than I expected it to. Maria didn't have an answer for that right away, and for a while, neither of them said anything. The vault quiet except for the hum of the old fluorescent tube. "What happens Monday?" she finally asked. "Monday," Warren said, "I stop being invisible." He said it without drama, the way he said most things, but Maria would remember, long after the deal closed and her own career had moved on to other rooms and other files, that it was the first time all week she'd heard a sentence in that building that sounded completely, entirely true. Her name was Maria Castillo, 28 years old, second-year associate on loan from Kane Holdings outside counsel, and she had not slept properly in 4 nights. She had also, unlike everyone else on the 14th floor, actually looked at Warren Doyle. Really looked, the way you look at someone when you're the only person under 30 in a building who still says good morning to the maintenance staff out of simple, unremarkable decency rather than performance. It started with small things. She noticed he never used the elevator when executives ran it, even when it would have saved him 10 minutes, stepping back with a small nod that she'd first read as deference and later suspected was something closer to habit, the careful habit of a man who had spent years making himself smaller than the room required. She noticed, too, that he was the only person on staff who knew, without checking a directory, which conduit ran behind which wall on the 3rd floor, which she'd only discovered when a water main cracked during a rainstorm, and Warren had directed the emergency crew to the exact junction box before the building engineer had even opened his laptop. "You used to work construction?" she'd asked him once, in the stairwell, both of them sheltering from the noise of a fire drill nobody believed was real. "Something like that," Warren had said, and left it there, the way he left almost everything. But it was the photograph that finally cracked it open. She was standing in that same 3rd-floor stairwell on Thursday night, waiting out a different fire drill, this one very real. Someone had burned popcorn in the break room microwave hard enough to trip the whole system, when she found herself, for the first time in 2 years of walking past it, actually studying the black and white photo bolted to the wall. 2 young engineers, a woman with a hard hat pushed back, laughing. A man beside her, younger, leaner, but something in the set of the jaw. Maria stepped closer. The brass plaque beneath the photo, tarnished with age, read, "Groundbreaking, Halloway Steel Plant, No. 2, 1987. E. Doyle, Chief Engineer. W. Doyle, Lead Designer." She had read that plaque 100 times without reading it. Now the letters rearranged themselves in her mind with the particular click of a lock finding its key. W. Doyle. She thought of the list she'd made 2 nights ago at midnight. Doyle, Warren, hired 2008, facilities. She thought of the ring she'd noticed once, on a thin chain under his collar when he'd bent to pick up a drop stapler for her, and how she'd assumed, the way anyone would, that it was sentimental, a father's ring maybe, or a piece he couldn't afford to have resized. She thought about how his hands, when he did small repairs around the office that were technically outside his job description, realigning a door that had been sticking for months, adjusting a support bracket under a bookshelf that had been wobbling since before she started, moved with a precision that had nothing to do with $14 an hour. She went back to her temporary desk that night and pulled every scrap of public record she could find on the founding of Halloway Steel. It took her 3 hours, half a pot of burnt coffee, and one increasingly frantic phone call to a records clerk at the county courthouse who owed her a favor. But by 2 a.m., she had it laid out in front of her like the pieces of something that had been broken and hidden in plain sight for 15 years. Eleanor and Warren Doyle, co-founders of Halloway Steel, 1987. Eleanor Doyle, deceased, 15 years. No, she corrected herself, checking the date again, 11 years ago. Warren Doyle, no public record of employment or residence after 2009, when the couple sold their controlling interest into a private trust structure ahead of the recession, until, she scrolled, a facilities hire in 2008, Address matching a modest apartment 40 minutes from the plant. The dates didn't quite line up cleanly. Grief has a way of blurring paperwork the same way it blurs everything else. And it would take her another day to untangle that Warren had, in fact, quietly stepped back from active operations in 2009 after Eleanor's death, then re-entered the building anonymously the following year. The timeline scrambled by county filing delays. She'd have no way of knowing about it 2 a.m., but the shape of it was there, undeniable, glowing on her laptop screen like a live wire. The man mopping the 14th floor was not a stranger to the company's history. He was the company's history. She sat back in her chair, and for a long moment, in the emptied-out office with only the hum of the HVAC system for company, Maria Castillo felt something she hadn't expected to feel about a deal she'd been treating, until that moment, as pure paperwork. She felt afraid for him, because she understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly what would happen the instant she told anyone what she'd found. The sharks upstairs would stop seeing an inconvenience and start seeing a target. And 18 years of Warren Doyle's careful, deliberate invisibility would end, whether he was ready or not. She almost didn't tell anyone, but by Friday morning she didn't have to, because someone else had followed the same trail she had, faster and with far less patience and far less regard for what it would cost the man at the center of it. Preston Kane did not like waiting, and he liked being made to look foolish even less. And by Friday at 9 in the morning, 3 days past a deadline his acquisitions team had promised him twice, he had reached the specific temperature of fury that made grown executives find urgent reasons to be somewhere else. "I want a name," he said, to a conference room that included Whitcomb, 4 lawyers, and Trent Ackerley, who had made the catastrophic decision to still be in the room. Not a shareholder ID, not initials on a trust document from a Reagan-era filing cabinet. A name, today. "We have a lead," said one of the lawyers. Not Maria, who sat quiet at the far end of the table, having decided overnight to say nothing until she understood exactly what she was protecting and from whom. "It's unconfirmed, but there's a strong indication the beneficiary may be a current employee." Kane's head turned slowly. A current employee? Facilities staff, hired 2008. The room went very quiet, the specific quiet of a dozen expensive people simultaneously doing the math on how embarrassing this was about to be for someone. "You're telling me," Kane said, each word placed like a stone, "that the man who holds veto power over a $900 million acquisition has been mopping this floor. For how long?" Nobody answered right away. 18 years, Whitcomb finally said, very quietly, as though saying it softer might make it hurt less. Kane stood. He did not raise his voice. Men who'd built empires the size of his rarely needed to, but something in the stillness of him was worse than shouting. "Bring him up. Sir, we should verify. Bring him up now." Trent Ackerley found Warren in the basement, restocking the paper towel dispenser outside the vault, and for the first time in 18 years, he did not know how to speak to him. "Mr. Doyle." The honorific came out clumsy, unfamiliar in his mouth, like a language he'd never bothered learning because he'd never expected to need it. "They want you upstairs, the East Conference Room." Warren set down the roll of paper towels, unhurried, the way he did everything. "Who's they?" "Mr. Kane, Mr. Whitcomb, the Dath, everyone." "For what reason?" Trent's jaw worked. 3 days ago, he'd have said something cutting, something about being told, not asked. Now he just looked at the older man in front of him, really looked, the way Maria had learned to, too late to matter, and something like shame moved across his face. "I think you know," Trent said quietly. Warren looked at him for a long moment. Then he untied his cleaning apron, folded it once, and set it on the supply cart with the same careful precision he applied to everything, and said the only thing that felt true. 18 years, Mr. Ackerley, and that's the first time you've called me Mr. He didn't wait for a response. He walked past Trent toward the elevator, and this time, for the first time in 18 years, he did not step back to let an executive board it first. Down the hallway, a few employees had gathered by the coffee station, drawn by the particular gravity of an unfolding event none of them fully understood yet, watching Warren walk past with his apron folded under one arm like it was the last ordinary thing he'd ever carry. Dale Prater was among them, and though he didn't know what was happening, some old instinct told him it mattered, and he straightened up a little as Warren passed. The small, unconscious respect one working man gives another when he senses, without proof yet, that something important is about to be set right. The doors closed on both of them in silence, and somewhere above, in a conference room full of billionaires and lawyers and a young associate who'd figured it out 3 days too soon, the point of no return had already arrived. Because whatever happened in the next 10 minutes, Warren Doyle was never going to be invisible in this building again. The elevator climbed slowly, the way old elevators do, each floor announcing itself with a soft chime that seemed to Trent unbearably loud in the silence between them. "Mr. Doyle," Trent said, somewhere around the 6th floor, the words coming out smaller than he meant them to. "I owe you an apology. I don't even know where to start with one big enough." Warren watched the floor numbers climb. "You don't owe me a speech, Mr. Ackerley. You owe the people you talk to in hallways a little more patience than you've been giving them. That's a debt you can pay forward instead of back. I called you slow, in front of people, more than once. You did. Why didn't you ever say anything? Report it, push back, anything?" Warren considered the question the way he considered most things, slowly and without performance. "Because for a long time, Mr. Ackerley, I needed this building to think I was exactly what you thought I was. A man who cleans floors and doesn't say much. It was easier to carry what I was carrying if nobody looked at me closely enough to ask questions I wasn't ready to answer." The elevator chimed again, 9th floor. "You weren't cruel because you're a cruel man. You were cruel because you'd decided, without ever checking, that I wasn't worth being curious about. That's a more common sickness than you'd think, and it costs people like me more than folks like you ever notice." Trent said nothing to that, because there was nothing honest he could say that wouldn't have sounded like an excuse, and for once in his career, he seemed to understand that silence was the more respectable option. The elevator reached the top floor. The doors opened onto a hallway that Warren had mopped 1,000 times, humming with the particular hush of an office that knew something enormous was about to happen behind a closed door and didn't yet know what. The East Conference Room went silent when the door opened, the particular silence of a room recalibrating its assumptions in real time. Warren walked in, still wearing his gray uniform, Doyle stitched crooked over his chest, cleaning cart left behind in the hallway like a life he was setting down at the threshold. He did not look rushed. He did not look afraid. 11 years of grief and 18 years of practiced patience had given him a stillness that made half the room, without quite understanding why, straighten in their chairs. Preston Kane stood at the head of the table. He did not sit back down. "Mr. Doyle," Kane said, testing the name like it might not fit. "I'm told you may have some connection to a trust instrument relevant to this transaction." "I have more than a connection," Warren said. His voice was the same voice he'd used to tell Trent Ackerley the floor was almost dry, even, unhurried, without a trace of theater, which made it land harder than if he'd shouted. "I wrote it." Whitcomb made a sound like the air had left him. "Explain," Kane said. Warren walked to the head of the table, not Kane's end, the empty chair beside it, the one nobody had thought to offer him, and that he took without asking, and set both hands flat on the polished wood, the same hands that had scrubbed that exact surface every night for 18 years. "My name is Warren Doyle," he said. "In 1987, my wife Eleanor and I built Halloway Steel out of a machine shop and a bank loan neither of us could really afford. She was the engineer. I designed the plant floor. We built this company on the idea that the people who worked the line deserved to know their jobs wouldn't be sold out from under them the moment somebody richer than us decided we were worth more broken apart than whole." He let that sit a moment. "In 2009, 6 months after Eleanor died, I sold our controlling interest into a trust because I couldn't run this place anymore, and I wasn't going to pretend I could. But I built one clause into that instrument because even grieving, I hadn't forgotten what she and I promised each other the day we broke ground on the second plant." He nodded, faintly, toward the door, toward the stairwell 3 floors up, where a photograph nobody looked at twice. "Any sale above a certain size requires my personal, notarized consent. Not the board's, not Mr. Whitcomb's, mine." Kane's face had gone very still, the stillness of a man recalculating every conversation he'd had in this building for the last week. Then a year later, Warren continued, I came back. Not to run anything. I couldn't sit in an office that used to be ours and pretend she wasn't gone. But I could clean these floors and watch and make sure that if this day ever came, and I always knew it would, someone always comes, sooner or later, with enough money to make an offer nobody thinks they can refuse, I'd be standing close enough to have a say in what happened to the people who work here. He looked, finally, directly at Preston Kane. So to answer your question, Mr. Kane, you've spent 3 days, and no small amount of your own money, trying to locate the shareholder who can sign off on this deal. He let the smallest pause sit, not for effect, but because 18 years of silence deserved exactly one unhurried breath before it ended. You're negotiating with me. The silence that followed had weight to it. The specific silence of a room where several careers had just quietly ended, and at least one had just as quietly begun. Trent Ackerley, standing near the door, looked like a man watching his own eulogy being read aloud. Whitcomb had both hands pressed flat over his face, and Maria Castillo, seated at the far end of the table, allowed herself, for the first time in 4 sleepless nights, the smallest exhale of relief. Not because the deal was saved, but because the man she'd spent 3 days quietly trying to protect had walked in and protected himself, exactly the way she'd suspected all along that he could. Kane recovered first, because men like Kane always did. It was, in its own way, the thing that had made him $11 billion. Mr. Doyle, he said, and something in his voice had shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but the recalibrated respect of a predator realizing the animal in front of him was not, in fact, prey. I'd like to understand your terms. I imagine you would. Warren finally sat down, in the chair that had been empty, at the head of the table that had never once, in 18 years, had a place set for him. Let's start with the 1,100 people on that floor who've spent this week terrified they're about to lose everything so you can add a line to a portfolio. I want every current employee's position protected for a minimum of 3 years. No exceptions, no loopholes buried in subsection language your lawyers think I'm too tired to read. I want the pension fund fully honored, not restructured, not reviewed, fully honored. That's a significant ask on valuation. I'm not finished. Warren's voice didn't rise, but something in it hardened, the particular hardness of a man who had waited 18 years to say exactly this. I want the plant floor named after my wife, not the holding company, not the parent brand. The floor where she stood the day we broke ground, wearing a hard hat that was too big for her, laughing at me because I told her a beam was crooked when it wasn't. His voice caught, just slightly, for the first time in the entire conversation, the only crack 18 years of composure allowed to show. Eleanor Doyle built that floor with her own 2 hands, before either of us had a dollar to our name. I won't sell it to a man who doesn't know her name. Kane looked at him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he pulled out the chair across from Warren and sat down himself, not towering over the table anymore, but level with him. The way you sit across from someone you've decided, mid-conversation, is worth actually negotiating with rather than simply outlasting. 3 years protection, full pension. The floor gets her name. Kane extended a hand. I can work with that, Mr. Doyle. I'd have expected to pay considerably more to get considerably less good sense out of this room in the last 3 days. Warren looked at the offered hand for a moment, not with suspicion, but with the particular weight of a man deciding whether 18 years of being unseen had earned him the right to take his time about being seen now. Then he shook it. One more thing, Warren said, as the room began to exhale, as Whitcomb started quietly to weep with something that looked like relief and something that looked like shame in equal measure. Trent Ackerley's head came up like he'd been struck. Yes, sir? Sir. Warren noted it, filed it away, said nothing about the word itself. You threatened to fire me this week for cleaning a conference room I've cleaned every night for 18 years, during the 1 week you needed me most, because it was easier to blame the invisible man than ask a hard question. Warren's voice was quiet, without cruelty, which somehow made it land harder than cruelty would have. You're not fired. Nobody in this building is losing their job over my signature. That was never how I intended to use it. But I'd ask you to remember, the next time somebody in a gray uniform is standing in your hallway, that you don't actually know what they're carrying. Trent Ackerley, 34 years old, Associate Director of Operations, said nothing at all. because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have sounded smaller than the silence. The deal closed on a Tuesday, 3 weeks later, with considerably less drama than the week that had preceded it, the way most things do once the truth of them has finally been said out loud, instead of chased through file cabinets in the middle of the night. Warren Doyle did not take an office. Kane's team offered him one twice, a corner suite on the top floor with a view of the river, and both times Warren declined, politely, without much explanation beyond the fact that he'd never much liked how quiet those rooms got. He did, however, accept one thing: a seat on the newly formed Employee Protection Oversight Board, a position with no salary attached because he asked that it have none, and a standing invitation to walk the plant floor, now officially renamed the Eleanor Doyle Fabrication Wing, the brass letters installed the same week the ink dried on the sale, any time he wanted, for as long as he wanted. He still came in at 6 in the morning, not because he had to. Kane's people had made it clear, more than once, that he never had to lift a mop again in his life if he chose not to. But there was something in the rhythm of it that Warren wasn't ready to give up. The quiet of an empty hallway before the building woke, the particular peace of doing a simple thing well, the closeness to a floor his wife had helped design that no office view, however high, could replace. On the Friday after the deal closed, Maria Castillo found him in the third-floor stairwell, standing in front of the old photograph, a rag in one hand. Though the glass over the frame hadn't collected a speck of dust in 18 years, he'd made sure of that personally, every week, without ever telling anyone why. "You didn't have to keep doing this," she said, nodding at the photo, at the rag. "Any of it. The cleaning. The 18 years of it." Warren considered the question longer than she expected. "After she died," he said finally, "I didn't know how to be anywhere that wasn't near something she'd built. This building was the last place her hands touched something and made it stand up straight. I couldn't run it anymore. Grief doesn't let you run things. But I could still be near it. Cleaning it seemed like the smallest, most honest way to stay close, without pretending I was still the man who used to sit at the head of that table." He looked at the photograph a moment longer. Eleanor, 29, laughing, hard hat pushed back, a hand flat against a beam that had held for 39 years and would hold, now, under her own name, for a great many more. "People stopped seeing me a long time ago," Warren said. "I let them. It was easier than being asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. But I always knew a day would come when somebody would need what I had, and when it did, I wanted to still be standing close enough to use it right." Maria nodded slowly. "Trent Ackerley resigned this morning. Did you hear?" "I heard." Warren's face didn't change much. "I didn't ask for that." "I know. He did it himself. Said he couldn't look at the hallway the same way anymore." Warren considered that for a moment, and something in his expression, not quite a smile, but close to its shadow, moved and settled. "Good," he said simply. "That's the kind of thing a man ought to figure out on his own. Nobody ever learned much from being told." He picked his cleaning cart back up because his shift, technically, still had 40 minutes left on it, and old habits, especially the ones a man builds his whole second life around, don't dissolve just because the truth finally gets said out loud in a boardroom. At the bottom of the stairwell, before he turned the corner toward the east hallway, he glanced back once more at the photograph, at Eleanor, at the crooked beam that was never crooked, at the plant floor that now, finally, carried her name where anyone walking through could see it. "Somebody get him out of the hallway before Whitcomb sees him," Trent Ackerley had said that first morning, not knowing the man he was talking past held more power in that building than every name on the executive floor combined. Warren Doyle wheeled his cart down the hallway one more time, in no hurry at all, and thought, not for the first time, that the people worth watching in this world were rarely the ones making the most noise in the room. Sometimes they were the ones nobody had thought to look at twice, quietly holding up more than anyone around them would ever think to ask. 6 months later, on a gray Tuesday morning that felt, in every ordinary way, like any of the 18 years' worth of Tuesdays before it, Warren Doyle stood at the edge of the Eleanor Doyle fabrication wing and watched the 7 a.m. shift clock in. The floor sounded the way it had always sounded, the low hum of the line starting up, the clatter of a forklift somewhere near the loading bay, someone's radio playing too loud from a break room that hadn't changed its coffee brand in a decade. Nothing about the noise was different. That was, in its own quiet way, the entire point. Warren had asked for exactly one thing above all others in that boardroom, and it wasn't the naming rights, and it wasn't the pension guarantee, though both of those mattered plenty. It was this, the sound of a floor that hadn't been hollowed out, machines still running, names still on badges, families still able to plan next year around a paycheck that hadn't disappeared into somebody else's spreadsheet. Dale Prater found him there, same as always, on his way in for the day shift. Heard the pension audit came back clean, Dale said. Full funding. My wife about cried when I told her. Kane kept his word, Warren said. Man's earned some things I didn't expect to give him credit for. You still surprised by that? Warren considered it honestly. Every day a little. Dale clapped him once on the shoulder, the easy, familiar gesture of a man who'd never once needed a title to know who deserved respect, and headed for his station. Warren stayed a while longer at the edge of the floor, watching the shift settle into its rhythm, and then did what he'd done nearly every morning for 18 years, and saw no reason to stop doing now. He picked up a rag and wiped down the handrail at the top of the stairs, not because anyone required it of him, and not because the building needed a man worth what he was worth to be caught wiping down handrails, but because there was a particular, uncomplicated peace in doing a small thing well, and he had decided a long time ago that peace like that wasn't something a man should give up just because his circumstances changed. Maria Castillo stopped by that afternoon. She'd stayed on with the newly restructured Halloway board as outside counsel, a role she'd specifically requested rather than the partnership track she'd been circling before, because, she told Warren once, she'd learned more about what mattered in that 1 week than in 4 years of law school. She found him in the stairwell again, in front of the old photograph, which had been reframed since the deal closed. Same picture, same crooked that wasn't crooked beam, but with a small brass plaque added beneath it now. E. Doyle and W. Doyle, founders, built on the promise that no one who works here stands alone. Kane's people wanted to put up a bigger portrait, Maria said. Something in the lobby, marble plaque, the whole production. He mentioned it again this morning. I told them no the first 4 times they asked. I know. I think that's why he keeps asking. He's not used to people turning down a spotlight. Warren almost smiled. There's not much a spotlight can teach a man my age that 18 years of an empty hallway didn't already teach him better. Maria leaned against the stairwell rail beside him, looking at the photograph a while herself. Can I tell you something? The night I found you down in the vault, I went home afterward, and I couldn't stop thinking about how close it came to going differently. If Trent had found that folder instead of me, if Kane's people had cornered you in that hallway before you were ready, you'd built something that could have been used against you as easily as it protected you. I know it, Warren said. I thought about that more nights than I'll admit to. So why take the risk? Why not just tell someone, years ago, quietly, and let the clause do its work without waiting for a crisis to force your hand? Warren was quiet for a while. The particular quiet of a man choosing his words the way he'd choose a tool for a job, carefully, and only once he was sure it was the right one. Because grief doesn't hand you a schedule, he finally said. I told myself for years I was waiting for the right moment. Truth is, I don't think I was ready to be Warren Doyle again until somebody made me be. Cleaning these floors let me be nobody for a while. Nobody doesn't grieve as loud as somebody does, but nobody also doesn't get to keep a promise to the people on that line. And eventually, a man has to decide which kind of quiet he can live with. Maria nodded slowly, filing that away the way she filed most things Warren said to her now, carefully and for keeping. For what it's worth, she said, I think you got the timing right down to the day. I had some help, Warren said, and looked at her, and for the first time in the whole strange, upended year, something like real warmth moved across his face. Not everyone in this building forgot how to see people. Turns out that mattered more than any clause I ever wrote. He folded the rag, set it down, and looked back at the photograph one last time. Eleanor, 29, laughing, hard hat pushed back, her hand flat against a beam that had held steady for 39 years and would go on holding, now, under her own name, for a great many more. Somewhere below them, the 7 a.m. shift moved on into its ordinary Tuesday. 1,100 paychecks still arriving on schedule. 1,100 lives still standing on a floor that a grieving man had quietly refused to let anyone take out from under them. Warren Doyle picked his cart back up, because his shift technically still had time left on it, and walked on down the hallway, no longer invisible, not anymore, but no less himself for finally being seen.